And welcome to Rome. I'm excited about introducing you to ancient Rome today. When you think of Rome, I know when we started Greece, I asked you, were there any words you thought of related to Greece? What words pop into your mind when I say ancient Rome? It can be anything. Yes.
Like Caesar.
Caesar. Colosseum. What other words?
Gladiator.
Gladiators. What else? Chariots. Is that what you were going to say? Chariot races. What else?
Desert.
Fire.
Pardon?
The desert.
The desert.
Jesus being crucified.
Jesus being crucified. What were you? Okay. What else?
What was the first guy who turned Rome into Christianity?
The first guy who what?
Turned Rome into Christianity.
Constantine. Emperor Constantine in around 313. Yes.
What was? No, never mind.
Fighting.
What movies do you think of? Any movies about ancient Rome? No one's watched Gladiator or Ben-Hur, which is a really old famous movie. Ben-Hur. Any other things come to your mind? How about Nero playing his fiddle while the city burns? Or the persecution of Christians? Yeah.
Oh, Julius Caesar when he got stabbed.
Julius Caesar. Et tu, Brute? Ah. Okay, yeah.
Was there a library that burned down in Rome too, or was it somewhere else?
That's Alexandria is what I think you're thinking of, and that was a real tragedy. But I don't know if a library burned when Nero was playing his fiddle, but the really great library that burned down was in Egypt, Alexandria, Egypt. Anything else? Okay, yes.
Columns? Like their columns?
Columns, yes. In fact, the Romans took those slender Greek columns and they made them bigger and fancier. They put Corinthian decorations at the top, and we'll be learning a little bit about that. Well, ancient Rome is put simultaneous with the rise of Christianity. And like Izzy pointed out, it was when Christ was born and lived and was crucified. But the Roman Republic started in 509 BC. So to give you just a general idea of where Rome is, we have, I always say, if I'm the cross, which used to be the dividing line for AD and BC. Now they've changed the meanings, but if I'm the cross, this 500 years is the Roman Republic, and this 500 years is the Roman Empire, and so Rome lasted about 1,000 years. What came before Rome? Before we started studying Rome, Rome is the last of the ancient civilizations we're going to study. And it ends about 500 AD, 476 exactly, and 509. But let's say 500 BC to 500 AD. After this, the next period is going to be the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages. So we have done the ancient River Valley civilizations and Rome. Those are our ancient civilizations. Then we start the Middle Ages. Okay, so what's the first ancient civilization we learned about? Oh, please.
Oh,
Sumer. Okay. What were the other ones we learned about?
the first Chinese dynasty.
Okay, China,
Egyptian.
India,
Egypt.
Egypt, and Greece. So we've studied Sumer and Egypt and India, China, and Greece. And the Greece city-state started to arise about 750, and then the Romans conquered Greece. But you remember the historian Herodotus that we talked about the other day? Herodotus said, I'm pretty sure it was Herodotus that said, Greece has conquered her rude conquerors. In other words, Greece was so refined and polished and elegant and wonderful that the Romans just fell in love with Greece and copied a lot of the things. And they did. So we're in Rome now, and we have some interesting things to cover. We're going to learn about Hannibal from Carthage in Africa and how he and Rome fought in the Punic Wars. We're going to be learning how the Republic ended. The Republic is when Rome was ruled by its senators And then when they finally started having Caesars, that part is called the empire because they had an emperor. And we'll be studying some of these things. Today, what I wanted to give you are a few fun things. If I can have someone to help me pass this out. I'm going to give you a handout on how the planets were named, because the planets have Roman names. They're named after Roman gods, but these gods were copied from the Greeks. For example, the Romans called Zeus, what did they call him?
Wasn't he like no?
Jupiter. Neptune is Poseidon. Poseidon was called Neptune. Zeus was called Jupiter. Cronus, the original Titan god, the father of Zeus, is called Saturn, the old wise one. Aphrodite, the goddess of love, became Venus. Hades, Pluto. Ares, the god of war, became Mars. Good. Hermes, the messenger god, became Mercury. And so they named the planets. Does that sound like our planet names? Jupiter, Neptune, Saturn, Venus. Sound familiar? And also the days of the weeks, how they were named. I'm going to go over that a little later. But if someone wants to pass this out, that would be very helpful. And the other thing I'm going to hand out to you today is a thing to do reading notes while you read tonight to help you stay on track. Thank you, Izzy. So if we can pass that out. Don't lose that. Those reading notes are due tomorrow. All right. So let me tell you a little bit about the beginning of the Roman Republic. If you can look on page 129. This is so interesting, I think. The Romans arrived on the 7 hills. You know, Rome is built on 7 hills. Have you heard that before? Rome is built on 7 hills, and there are 7 hills there. Italy comes out into the Mediterranean Sea. It looks like a high-heeled boot. And it has the mountains, the Apennine Mountains, which run like a backbone down the side of Italy. But the Latins actually arrived in Rome in 800 BC, so why don't I put the date from 800 to 500 instead of from 500 to 500? The Latins arrived there in 800 BC, but I'm telling you the Republic started in 500. That's because when they arrived in Rome, there were other people living there. Now, I have 2 movies. One calls them the Etruscans and one calls them the Etruscans, so take your choice. But the Etruscans were there first, and the Romans came, and so they had to coexist with these people for a long time, and they were a small group, and the Etruscans were pretty friendly, and the Romans learned a lot of important things from them. They adapted their alphabet. They learned how some engineering things from them. They learned how to drain swampy land, and they learned some of their religious beliefs as well. But all of a sudden, well, it probably wasn't all of a sudden, but eventually the Latins became a stronger people, and they said, you know what? We want this land. You guys can leave. So they got rid of the Etruscans in 509. I'm sure it wasn't that simple, but they kicked them out in 509. And 509 is when they formed their own government, and it was kind of nice because they had a full group of people that were able to sit down and say, how do we want to run this government? And they set up a republic. Does anyone know what republic means? Well, public means people. You know, like when you're out in the public, you're out among other people, right? Your mother says, you're not going out in public dressed like that, right? The public. And so, means of the. So this is really, republic means thing of the people. So the republic is what they started, and this is how they did it. Look with me on page 129 where it says the government takes shape. First of all, is your book marked by somebody already?
Yeah.
Okay. First they had a Senate. How many members were in the Senate? 300. And these members were patricians. That means they were at the wealthy class, the top class in Rome. So if you were going to be a senator, you had to be a patrician and come from that group. Now these 300 senators, once they were elected, they could serve for life. So they had 300 senators. Then the senators made the laws for the land. That means 300 people had to come to a majority agreement. So you got lots of good opinions. That usually makes better laws than if just a king's making the laws, right? Because you have more opinions and ideas being shared. Well, this is good about it, but this is bad about it. That's wonderful. So having those 300 in the Senate to make the laws. But then from that class, every year they would elect 2 councils. And the councils, I believe they only served for 1 term, which was a year. They were from the patrician, but they would run the business of government and command the armies. So that was their job. Now, if they were tied up with the armies, you can see why they were only allowed to serve 1 term. And that's because many times in history, military groups have overthrown leadership. And so to keep them from getting too high and mighty, they only served for a short time. Now, by limiting their time in office, it was a system of checks on power so that the Senate could stay in power. Now, if there was a war, now here's a people that did not want to have a king or an emperor or a dictator, but in time of war, they choose a dictator. In time of war, the Senate chooses a dictator. He has a 6-month limit on his rule. So why do they want a dictator in time of war?
So they're not all like arguing over something if there's like battle going.
Brilliant. Okay, good. Good. Imagine the army, as Riley pointed out, everybody has their own opinion. Imagine the army, they're in a tight crunch and they're saying, should we go north or south? And before they can move, 300 people have to agree on which way they should go. Do you think they'd ever get anywhere? They'd be dead by the time the decision was made. In a time of war, you need one distinct leader so that you can act quickly. Even if that leader makes a mistake, but you do things in a timely way, sometimes you can pull through that mistake. But there has to be someone who's making the calls. And that's why I know several people in the military, including my daughter. She's a captain in the Army. And she said to me, I said, well, how can you obey so unquestioningly to a leader? She said, you can't operate without doing that. It's not going to function. She said, the only time I would not obey my leader is if they said something ridiculous like, shoot that 5-year-old. That went against her conscience. But as far as orders, you always obey unquestioningly. Otherwise, imagine if all the soldiers argued whether they were going to follow commands. You'd never win a war. So a dictator or one person in charge is really important during this time. So how long did senators serve, everybody?
1 year.
Senators.
Oh, for life.
For life. Councils?
For 1 year.
And a dictator,
For 6 months.
6 months. An example of a model dictator, a very famous one, is Cincinnati. There's a city named after him in Ohio. But Cincinnati was, the story goes, he was out plowing in his field, and he was called because they knew he was a powerful leader and wise, so he was called to take over the dictatorship. He won the war in 16 days and was back plowing his field. So he didn't try to stay in power or anything. He just did his job and went back to his regular time of living. Now, plebeians. Does anyone know what plebeians are? Yeah, plebeians are the lower class, the common people, the blue-collar workers. What do they call freshmen in a lot of colleges? Plebes. Yep, for being plebeians. It's a put down to call you plebes, but that's what they'll call you. You're freshmen, you're in college, you're plebes. And plebeians were that class that really supported the society. They were the backbone, but they had little influence in the government. They couldn't do anything in the government. So finally, you're going to read about tonight, and I want you to be able to tell me how the plebeians finally got a voice in the government. I want you to be able to tell me what happened to cause that. Now, Rome has had a huge effect on you. You're sitting here right now. I'd say, from my knowledge, at least half of you are Christians. And Rome had a huge effect on Christianity. I'm going to share with you a little bit about Zeno and his Stoicism. You've learned that Zeno was responsible for Stoicism, but the Romans adopted these Stoic views, and they had a big influence on Western Christianity. In other words, the Romans and the Roman Catholic Church, which was the only church for a while, so we're all descendants from the Roman Catholic Church. But for a while, that was the church, and they adopted the ideas of Stoicism, and they brought them into religion. And I'll explain that a little more later. That's an interesting story. But not only did Rome affect the Western Christianity, when the other church, the Eastern Church, split off from the Roman Catholic Church and they became the Eastern Orthodox or the Greek Orthodox Church, they have a different form of religion. For one thing, many Christian churches will have a picture of Christ on the cross or just a picture of him up front with his arms open or whatever. They have these things. Greek Orthodox don't do that. They don't believe in making any kind of icon that people could mistakenly give religious power to. So they have a more simple kind of church, but they have kept the mystery of Christianity. And there's a mysticism in the Eastern Orthodox Church that is really a neat thing to experience. And the difference between Western and Eastern Christians is really quite obvious. I have a nephew who he was given this award. He wrote up a proposal of something he would like to study outside his field of study, and he put it in for this scholarship, and he got this paid for thing where he went to all these Eastern Orthodox churches and monasteries and got to experience their life with them, and then wrote a paper on the Eastern and Western mentality. And I think it's really very interesting to hear his stories and how when you are in an Eastern Orthodox church, you would walk into the sanctuary and you would be quiet and respectful. Walk in to Calamasa Church sometime. People are up front and the whole congregation is yakking. Blah, 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 blah. I go in there, I can't believe it. This is a sanctuary. And they're all just visiting like they're at a picnic, you know, and you're trying to hear the guy make announcements or whatever it is, and they're just going to town. That wouldn't happen in an Eastern Orthodox church. There's kind of a, God still holds this, he's mighty, but he's still mysterious. And Westerners are always trying to make God their buddy, you know. And there's this different mentality. So the Romans contributed to the Western idea. And of course, the East contributed to the idea in Eastern Christianity. So that's one way that the Romans are still influencing you today. Another is they made up the word Senate. Do we have a Senate? Yes, we do. We have a Senate. We have veto. That's one of their words, the power to veto. And the idea of having checks on political power all came to us from Rome. Okay, you are going to read tonight about Roman society, and you're going to need to answer a couple questions on the roles of women, so pay attention to that when you're reading it. And I think if you use your reading notes, it's going to help you cover this really well. One of the things I love talking about is Hannibal. Hannibal was such a bright young man, and you're going to be reading about him too. Hannibal, not Hannibal the cannibal, but Hannibal of Rome. When he was 9 years old, and he lived in Carthage in Africa, the Romans came and fought his city, destroyed some things, killed a lot of his friends. And he hated Rome, and he made a vow when he was 9 years old that he would get even with Rome, that he would somehow do that. Now, a 9-year-old can make a vow, but do they very often keep that vow? Was that something you would expect them to do? Not necessarily, but this guy never forgot what he said, that he was going to get even with Rome. And you're going to read this.
Wow, he had that since he was 9?
Yes. And you're going to read this spectacular story of where, to surprise Rome in a surprise attack, Rome never worried about its back because there were high icy mountains there and they knew no one would come that way. But Hannibal did. Not only did he go over these icy mountains, he took elephants. Now, elephants are not engineered to walk on ice, right? What are an elephant's feet like? Do they have cleats?
No, they're big flat.
Yeah, it's like columns. They're smooth, they're flat. Can you imagine an elephant on the ice? Well, Quite a few of those elephants did slip and fall to their deaths, but some of them actually made it across these icy mountains for Hannibal's surprise attack. And I'm going to tell you more about that tomorrow after you read about it. Such an interesting story.
What do you want to get even up again? I forget.
Rome. And
what Rome Reuben?
he came to a city in Carthage, Africa, and attacked it and killed a lot of the friends that he had. And so he was really angry at Rome. Also, you're going to read in this section about how the Republic changes to the empire and how that happened. And we'll talk a little bit more in detail about Hannibal tomorrow, but I'm going to close with telling you a funny story, and then you can start reading. The 3 wars where Rome fought Hannibal are called the Punic Wars. Punic. And so I gave an essay one time, and I asked the students to write in the essay about the 3 Punic Wars between Hannibal and Rome. So I'm downstairs in my living room, in my kind of family room, sitting in a comfy chair, and I'm grading these essays, and my whole rest of my family's upstairs on their computers or whatever. And pretty soon I started laughing. I laughed, and then I laughed some more, and then I laughed. You know those kinds of few times in your life where you laugh so hard it hurts your gut and tears come out your eyes? I slid off the chair to the floor, and I was just laughing. Then I'd read another sentence, and I'd laugh even harder, because this student started his essay like this. Hannibal was just an adolescent when he started in the Punic Wars. And the whole essay was on the Punic Wars, and some of the sentences that made were so funny that I was just rolling, and my whole family came downstairs. What is wrong? Tell us. And so I had to read it to all of them. So if you get an essay on the Punic Wars, just remember it's spelled Punic, okay? And don't write me an essay like that unless you want to give me a good laugh, because I really, really roared when that happened. Oh my gosh, I was just dying. Okay, so.
You ever tell that student that?
Huh?
You ever tell that student that?
Well, I didn't tell it to the whole class because I didn't want to embarrass him, but I told him privately. I corrected him. Yeah, well, he was embarrassed actually, but I told him it was okay. All right, and so you're going to end your reading today with the Pax Romana, which is a wonderful period in Roman history because it was 200 years of peace. And one of my favorite emperors was during that time, Marcus Aurelius. So please read carefully, use your notes, and you can start doing that right now. Take your reading notes, get going. I'm going to be walking around and making sure you're on task.